My name is Kenneth Harl, and I teach ancient and Byzantine and early medieval history at Tulane University in New Orleans. And I'll be guiding you through a 36-lecture course on the Vikings. And this course is really an excellent way to introduce the early Middle Ages as well as medieval Scandinavia, because the Vikings have a very far-ranging impact on early medieval history, and in some instances, medieval history is almost inconceivable without them. But before we get into that and the structure of this class, I think it's useful to think about some of the stereotypes about Vikings, which most of us are familiar with. And they usually are stereotypes that are popularized in novel and film, and they're with us, and I think they're going to endure a long time. Viking is usually used to designate one's worst nightmare of a Nordic warrior, sporting a horned helmet, slashing with the two-headed axe, descending upon unsuspecting monks and peasants from longships. And believe me, we'll have a fair amount of Viking pillage and attacks in Western Europe and in Russia. But this is a stereotype, and it's important to stress that even the Scandinavians in the Middle Ages used the term Viking for a very specific occupation. The best explanation is that the word comes from Norse vik, meaning a cove or a small fjord. It would be a place where pirates would lurk and they could prey upon merchant ships. And so to go a Viking or to go out Viking was essentially a way of saying I was going out on a pirate raid. The term then gets extended to cover any Scandinavians between roughly 790 and 1100 who either go on raids or are trading or conquering overseas kingdoms or even engaged in settlements such as Iceland, which is, we speak of the Viking Age settlement. So it's fair to say that Scandinavia from 790 to 1100 experienced what we call the Viking Age, and you can talk of Scandinavian civilization in the Viking Age. On the other hand, the term Viking really should be used to designate Scandinavians overseas, especially as raiders, attackers of Christian kingdoms, and then later as merchants as well as colonizers and eventually as kings, such as King Canute of Denmark, who conquers England in 1014, 1016. So we need to keep that designation in mind. The other important thing we have to keep in mind is that Scandinavians were known by a number of names overseas. Viking was just one of several. Frankish chronicles, that is, the monks who would be writing today in what is Western Europe, France, the lowlands, West Germany, often just vaguely referred to them as Northmen or Normanni, from which we get the word Normans. And that is well known in the prayers that are repeated in the 9th century, "O Lord, deliver us from the fury of the Northmen," common prayer as a result of Viking raids. In England, where Danes were prominent, usually the Vikings are simply referred to as Danes. The term Norman is used for those Scandinavians who settle in Normandy in northern France. Those Scandinavians from Sweden who operated in Russia are very often known as the Rus, a word of obscure origin. There's several explanations for it, or Varangians, which means men of the pledge. That's a term used to designate especially Swedes and other Scandinavians who come to serve in the Byzantine armies. That is, they're men who take an oath and fight as a retinue to the Byzantine emperor. But all of these terms are referring to the same people. They are the Scandinavians from this period in the early Middle Ages who are popularly known as the Vikings. Now, we have an enormous amount of information about the Vikings. Unfortunately, most of it comes, at least in the early phases, from their opponents. So we're constantly filtering these monastic chronicles and hostile reports of their victims, and we're balancing that against archaeology and then what the Scandinavians tell about themselves in later generations when they've converted to Christianity. So part of the theme of this course is going to be looking at really three very different sets of evidence. The contemporary literary records, which are written by largely Christians, some Muslim accounts, who see the Vikings as hostile, as their worst nightmare, that stereotypical barbarian. And in the case of the Western Europeans, they're drawing on a very, very old Roman tradition of seeing northern barbarians